African leaders' plans to unite. Is this the end of external influence? For centuries, the story of Africa has been written by almost everyone but Africans. Its wealth, its power, and its future were dictated from foreign capitals, tied up by invisible chains long after the physical ones were meant to have been broken. The story was always one of dependency, resources flowing out, instructions flowing in. It was a continent being acted upon, not one taking action. But a new chapter is being written. Not by analysts in Paris, London, or Washington, but by a new generation of leaders and citizens in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. A wave of unity is sweeping across the continent. Leaders are locking arms, drawing a line in the sand, and declaring in one unified voice, no more. Alliances are being forged in the heart of Africa, for the benefit of Africa. And this revolution isn't just being televised, it's being live-streamed by the very people making it happen. The question isn't if Africa will rise anymore, but what the world will look like when it does. This is the story of a continent reclaiming its soul, its sovereignty, and its destiny. And it signals an end to everything that came before. To really get what's happening today, you have to understand the sheer weight of the history it's trying to shake off. This didn't start with the latest headlines, it started with the end of an era that never really ended. When European flags were lowered across Africa in the mid-20th century, they called it independence. But for many, it was just a rebranding of control. The foreign governors left, but the economic and political puppeteers stayed, pulling the strings from the shadows. This was the age of neocolonialism. The clearest example of this was a system the French called Francafrique. It was a tangled, shadowy web of deals and influence that kept former French colonies locked firmly in Paris's orbit. It was a system where African leaders were propped up or kicked out based on their loyalty not to their own people, but to France. And at the heart of it all is a currency that many see as the ultimate symbol of control, the CFA franc. Created by France back in 1945 as the franc of the French colonies of Africa, it was a tool of empire. Today, it's still used by 14 African nations. For decades, these countries were forced to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves directly into the French treasury. While that rule has recently been changed, the currency's peg to the euro still gives Paris and the European Central Bank huge sway over their economic policies. Just think about that. A sovereign nation's wealth, sitting in the vaults of its former colonizer. Critics have argued for years that this arrangement has been devastating. Renowned economists point out that tying the CFA to the strong euro makes exports from these African nations expensive and uncompetitive, while making imports from Europe artificially cheap. It hollows out local industry. The numbers don't lie. Economist Ndongo Sylla notes that major CFA countries like Ivory Coast and Senegal hit their peak income per capita decades ago and have been struggling ever since. It was a system built for extraction, not for growth. This economic grip allowed for the systematic plunder of Africa's incredible natural resources. The continent, holding almost a third of the world's mineral reserves, effectively became the world's quarry. Its cocoa, its gold, its uranium, its coltan, all dug up and shipped abroad for processing, with a tiny fraction of the profit ever returning to the nations it came from. This created the defining paradox of the post-colonial era, a resource-rich continent filled with impoverished people. Countries got trapped as suppliers of raw materials, their futures tied to the whims of global market prices and the demands of Western and, more recently, Chinese buyers. The dependency wasn't just about money, it was military. Foreign military bases, especially French ones, were scattered across West Africa. They were sold as tools for stability and fighting terrorism, but for many Africans, they were just symbols of a broken sovereignty. They were a constant reminder that the ultimate guarantor of their security wasn't their own army, but a foreign power whose interests would always come first. This created a vicious cycle. African nations were told they were too unstable to manage their own security, but the foreign interventions often fueled the very instability they claimed to be fighting. This whole structure was held up by global institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. They offered loans, but the loans came with strings attached. These structural adjustment programs forced countries to privatize industries, cut public spending, and deregulate their economies, policies that often opened the door for foreign corporations at the expense of local people. Aid became just another lever of control. As the UN's Claver Gatit has stressed, Africa has been caught in a web of structural barriers that trap countries in dependency. This was the problem. A carefully built system designed to keep wealth and power flowing from Africa to the outside world. An injustice that was just accepted as the way things were. But under the surface, the pressure was building. A new generation, born into this broken independence, started asking a very dangerous question: what if we just said no? Revolutions don't start quietly. They start with a roar. And in West Africa, that roar has been echoing across the Sahel for the past few years, shaking the foundations of the old world order. These aren't just a few isolated incidents. This is the agitation. This is the moment the people decide they will no longer tolerate the old way of doing things. The first tremors hit Mali in 2020, then Burkina Faso in 2022, and Niger in 2023. If you were only watching Western media, you probably heard one phrase: military coups. They were framed as chaotic, destabilizing power grabs. But on the streets of Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey, people saw something very different: acts of national liberation. The leaders who stepped up weren't your typical politicians. They were young, unapologetic, and spoke a language that hadn't been heard from African leadership in decades: the language of absolute sovereignty. Enter figures like Captain Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso and General Abdourahmane Tiani in Niger. They didn't talk about partnership with the West, they talked about breaking the chains of neocolonialism. Traore, in a speech that went viral across the Pan-African world, called out the pretense of independence from the 1960s and the plunder of their resources. He wasn't asking for a better deal, he was declaring the deal was over. We are not going to tremble, he promised. We are going to face up to it. And these weren't just words. They were followed by bold, world-shaking actions. The first move was demanding the withdrawal of French troops. For decades, the French military was just a fact of life in the Sahel. But one by one, the new leaders of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger told them to pack their bags and leave. They tore up defense agreements, and the world watched as French soldiers left bases they had occupied for years. The expulsion of the French ambassador from Niger was another clear signal that the days of France calling the shots were finished. This was followed by demands for U.S. troops to withdraw from Niger and Chad, a major blow to Washington's security strategy in the region. This defiance sent shockwaves through the West. ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, an organization many see as heavily influenced by Western interests, hit them with crippling sanctions. They even threatened to send in troops to restore the old government in Niger. But instead of backing down, the three nations did something incredible. They called the bluff. In September 2023, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger formed a mutual defense pact, the Alliance of Sahel States, AES. The message was unmistakable: an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. Then, in January 2024, they took another historic step and announced they were leaving ECOWAS altogether, accusing the bloc of serving foreign powers instead of its own people. By July 2024, they made their union official, signing a treaty to create the Confederation of Sahel States. This was the birth of a new, sovereignty-first bloc in the heart of Africa, forged in defiance. They pivoted, seeking new security partners, most notably Russia, not as a new master, but as a tool to achieve their own security on their own terms. The movement quickly became about more than just the military. It became a fight for economic freedom. The calls to finally ditch the CFA franc grew louder than ever. Leaders in the AES, and even the newly elected president in Senegal, signaled they wanted out. The AES announced ambitious plans for a new common currency, potentially called the Sahel, which would be the single greatest act of monetary freedom in the region's history. And this wasn't just coming from the top. It was fueled by the people. Huge crowds marched in the streets across the Sahel, supporting the new leadership and demanding an end to foreign interference. They were reclaiming their pride and their future. They finally saw leaders who looked like them and spoke like them, not like polished diplomats from Western capitals. They saw, for the first time, a shot at real independence. The stakes couldn't be higher, but in their fight, they have lit a flame of hope that is spreading across the entire continent. This is so much more than a geopolitical story, it's a paradigm shift happening in real time. The old rules are being ripped up, and a new future is being written. If you believe in the vision of a self-determined Africa and want to follow this incredible story of liberation, make sure you're subscribed and have hit that notification bell. You aren't just watching a video, you're witnessing history, and we're here to document every step of the journey. Now, let's get back to how this revolution is being built, brick by sovereign brick. A revolution born from saying, no, can only survive if it starts building a yes. The roar of defiance has to be followed by the quiet, hard work of building a nation. This is the solution phase, where the continent isn't just tearing down the old house of dependency, but building a new one from the ground up on three fronts: economic freedom, political unity, and a cultural rebirth. Part A, the economic liberation. The number one battlefront is the economy. For decades, Africa's job was to hand over its raw materials. The solution is to flip that script and build economies that work for Africans first. The new strategy is often called resource nationalism, but it's not about just seizing assets. It's a strategic move to control their own wealth. It's about demanding a fair share of the profits from the continent's own minerals. All across Africa, governments are rewriting the rules. In Mali, the government passed a new mining law allowing the state to take up to a 35% stake in new projects. In Guinea, they're demanding a bigger slice of the pie from the country's huge iron ore deposits. Countries like Ghana, Namibia, and Zimbabwe have started banning the export of unprocessed critical minerals like lithium. They are insisting that the high-value processing work, the part that makes the real money, has to happen on African soil. This is a huge deal. It's a declaration that Africa will no longer be just the world's quarry, it will be its workshop. This push is being supercharged by the Alliance of Sahel states. They aren't waiting for anyone's permission. They've announced plans to create their own confederal bank for investment and development. This is a direct challenge to the Western-dominated financial system, a way to fund their own projects on their own terms. They're working on joint infrastructure programs for energy and agriculture, creating a foundation for a truly integrated economy, free from the old colonial ties. This local ambition is part of a bigger, continent-wide plan, the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA. The goal is to create the largest free trade zone in the world, connecting over 1 billion people. The simple idea is to make it easier for African countries to trade with each other, which has been shockingly difficult historically. By breaking down those barriers, the AFCFTA aims to build regional supply chains, boost industry, and make the continent less dependent on outside markets. It is Pan-Africanism in economic form. And while new partnerships, especially with China and Russia, are being formed, there's a sharp awareness of the danger of just swapping one boss for another. The new approach is about strategic engagement. African leaders are negotiating harder, demanding technology transfer and local jobs, making sure deals align with their own sovereign goals. The era of taking any deal that's on the table is over. Part B, Political and Cultural Sovereignty. Economic freedom doesn't mean much without political power. The second piece of the solution is the fight for a unified African voice on the world stage. For far too long, Africa has been a subject of discussion at the United Nations, but rarely a decision-maker. The most obvious symbol of this is the UN Security Council. Its structure is a relic of 1945, when most of Africa was still under colonial rule. Today, the African Union is leading a powerful, unified demand for reform. The call is clear: Africa, a continent of 1.4 billion people, demands at least 2 permanent seats with full rights, including the veto. As Sierra Leone's President Julius Maada Bio has argued, this isn't asking for a favor, it's a demand to fix a historical injustice. This is about reclaiming Africa's place in the world, moving from being a subject of resolutions to an author of them. This political confidence is powered by a resurgence of Pan-Africanism. Today's movements are consciously connecting themselves to the continent's great liberation thinkers, leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, and especially the revolutionary captain from Burkina Faso, Thomas Sankara, whose spirit clearly guides Ibrahim Traore. This isn't just a political strategy, it's an ideology that frames the struggle as one continental fight for total liberation. A huge part of this is reclaiming the narrative. It means seizing the microphone. The rise of independent African media is critical, but so is the symbolism of the leaders themselves. When they speak at the UN, they are increasingly speaking directly to the world, and especially to their own people and the diaspora. This is all tied to a cultural awakening. There's a growing movement to reform school curricula to teach African history from an African perspective and to elevate local languages. It's about decolonizing the mind, building a sense of pride that isn't defined by the colonial experience. The African diaspora is a critical partner here. There's a conscious effort to connect with people of African descent worldwide, framing this as a global struggle for dignity. Events like the planned 9th Pan-African Congress in Togo are designed to mobilize this global community and renew the push for these goals. Part C: The Vision for the Future. The final piece of the solution is a bold vision for what's next. The African Union's Agenda 2063 isn't just some policy document, it's a roadmap to the Africa we want. It pictures an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa, driven by its own citizens. And a powerful theme is taking center stage: justice. The AU has declared 2025 the year of justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. This is a historic push to finally address the deep wounds of slavery and colonialism, not just with apologies, but with concrete, reparatory justice. It's a call to settle historical debts and restructure the global systems that still reflect those old inequalities. The vision being built by the Alliance of Sahel states is a perfect example of this ambition: a confederation with a single passport, a joint defense force, and integrated economies, all driven by sovereignty. It is a bold experiment that, if it works, could be a blueprint for the entire continent. The solution isn't one single policy, it's a total transformation: economic, political, and cultural. We are at a historic turning point. The story of Africa, for so long written by others, is being decisively reclaimed. The problem was a legacy of chains. The agitation was the roar of defiance from the Sahel. And the solution is the patient, revolutionary work of forging a new path, one of economic self-reliance, political unity, and cultural pride. What we're seeing isn't the end of Africa's story. It's the end of the prologue. The main chapters are now being written by Africans themselves. The rise of the Alliance of Sahel states, the demand for control over their own resources, the call for a permanent voice in the world's highest councils, these are the coordinated footsteps of a giant awakening. Of course, the road ahead won't be easy. The old powers won't give up their influence quietly. But something fundamental has shifted. The spirit of self-determination, once the dream of liberation heroes, now walks the streets and sits in the halls of power. The end of external influence won't happen overnight. It is a declaration of intent, backed by the courage to act. It's the slow dismantling of an old, unjust world and the ambitious construction of a new one. Africa is not just rising, it is remaking itself. And in doing so, it will remake the world. So, the question we started with: is this the end of external influence? The answer unfolding before our very eyes is a resounding, continent-spanning yes. This conversation doesn't end here. The future of Africa is the future of the world. What are your thoughts on this new wave of unity? What challenges and opportunities do you see ahead? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to share this video. Helping to reclaim the narrative is part of the work. To keep understanding the forces that are truly shaping our world, click on one of these videos right here. Stay informed. Stay engaged.